So I often like to touch into kind of the current historical events, or when I reflect on the Dharma, the kind of nature of being alive. And so over the last week, there's been a whole lot of really touching articles and special events and media presentations on memorializing the events of 9/11. And I think everybody in this room remembers exactly where they were. It's one of those historical moments. I remember that morning I was actually in LA, and I had a ticket on there were two flights from Boston to LA, and I had a ticket on the plane, the return flight that hit the first tower, and so was in LA for a few more days after that. And I think now that we've had 15 years to look at that event and the repercussions, you know, historians pretty much have agreed, or seem to be agreeing, that the events of that day will reverberate for decades. We have 15 years now, and we're still kind of very fresh in the effects of what happened on that day in September. And so the subsequent invasions of Iraq and Afghanistan created a radicalization and a backlash that remains completely uncontrolled. I mean, so much was affected, so much unintended consequences. In our attempt to mete out justice to that rather small but dedicated radical organization, Al-Qaeda, we felt it necessary as a country to invade two countries. And through that process, the mounting of collateral damage to civilian populations kind of provided the propaganda material for a burgeoning radicalization, Islamic movement. All that video footage and all those stories of innocents being killed or dying in bombings, etc., was the fuel and the material skillfully used to radicalize more and more and more people. So that movement that was once small, maybe back in the year 2000, exploded. And so from that absolute horror of that day, where approximately 3,000 Americans died on 9/11, the events that cascaded, now there are estimates of between 1 million and 2 million people have been casualties of the reverberation of the actions after that. And in addition, there's at least 60 million people that have been displaced from their homes in the Mideast that are refugees. And those casualties continue to mount. The number of refugees continues to mount also. Unintended consequences. And back here at home, this is an old study. The RAND did a study in 2008, where we have, in 2008, they said there were 300,000 U.S. service people that returned with strong enough PTSD that it was affecting their lives and affecting the lives of their family members. And that was 8 years ago. And so I'm not sure what that number is now. Is it less? Is it 400,000, 500,000? And these are people we need to care for. Find ways and better ways to care for them and their family. So, unintended consequences. You know, the rippling effect. I mean, many of you here, or at least some of you here, are old enough to remember the Vietnam War and the strategy of many anti-war groups, you know, that were committed to ending that war. And a major strategy was, if you could get the powers that be to overreact, eventually the sympathy or public opinion would kind of move on your side, and then change may happen. It's the most ancient of tactics. You know, create an overreaction, and then whatever your movement is, for good or evil, can grow. So a relatively small number of radicals use that tactic, and they leverage those hellish actions into an exploding movement that's affected almost every quarter of this planet. But the success of that movement, when we look at it, hinged upon and relied upon our reaction. You know, unintended consequences. So that reaction is kind of a normal human reaction that we had, and in, you know, in some ways maybe we were all part of it. It's a reaction of hearts and minds that are relatively untrained, maybe great intellect, but the emotional intelligence wasn't quite up to the events, as it often isn't throughout history. And so the reactions, not so much actions, the reactions may be turned unskillful. And these reactions were what the Buddha would call, they were driven by the three poisons. In Buddhism, they're considered the root of human misery. And they're called in various ways: greed, anger, and foolishness, or greed, hatred, and delusion. You hear them talked about. And these are the essences, or the prime movers, of all the harmful and delusionary thoughts, speech, and actions that over and over derail the human potential. And of those three, delusion or foolishness is really the most fundamental. It's the seedbed, or the facilitator of the other two poisons, anger and greed. And by foolishness, I mean all the flavors of ignorance, whether it's conscious or unconscious. And what I mean by ignorance is ignorant to the way nature operates. You know, it's ignorance of the impermanence of everything. We take it down to our individual lives. It's when we find things that we like and we think we can grasp onto them and just hold them forever. And it's not set up that way. This creation is completely impermanent. You know, you start with the basics: old age, sickness, death, etc. But when we hold on to the pleasant really hard, it is like holding on to a kind of spiky rope that is then dragged through your hands. You get rope burn. It doesn't work. You know? So learning and developing an internalized visceral relationship with impermanence is part of a reduction of our individual suffering. Everything's in motion. You can look out into the stars. Everything's moving, changing, coming into being, disappearing. You can look in subatomic areas. Everything's moving. You keep looking deeper, deeper into the subatomic world, and everything is just vibration, energy vibrating. So that ignorance of the impermanent nature of everything is a big one. Another one is the not understanding the cause of suffering. It's oftentimes related to this impermanence business. We cling on to something that's not wanting it to change. Well, it's going to change. And if there's something we don't like, and we're thrashing and thrashing to get rid of it, if our whole life is just thrashing around trying to get rid of everything that's unpleasant, and we never have developed a way to be with the unpleasant, we're just exhausted because we can't control much. Can't control other people. Can't control the weather. So this suffering through clinging and grasping or thrashing to push things away, that's an exhausting manner of living. So the ignorance there is not knowing how to alleviate that suffering, not learning how not to cling so much, not to grasp so hard, not to thrash around so much because it's unpleasant. And every little increment of lessening of clinging, lessening of thrashing around reduces suffering. So it's not like all or nothing. If we can learn and train ourselves to cling a little less, we're going to have a little less suffering. That's just the way it is. And then there's the ignorance of the selfless nature of this creation. That's a more challenging question. That requires an exploration of the nature of self. Is there a permanent, solid, separate self? Is that possible to not be completely interrelated in some way with everything around us? Emotions change. Our thoughts change. Our bodies are changing all the time. All subject to causes and conditions. Well, what remains the same? So there's this exploration of self. And if we really believe fully or we're acting unconsciously that, well, there is a solid, separate self in this embattled environment, and we have to protect it, we have to puff it up, we have to enhance it, that's pretty tiring, but it's an exploration. And then there's the ignorance of that blindness to the reality of our deep interrelatedness. Our connection in this biosphere and beyond. The Indra's net, the Indian god Indra, who posited that the cosmos was made up of this beautiful net, and on each node there was a jewel that reflected all the other nodes. And there's nothing outside the net, but it's just infinite. And feeling a part of that is where this practice leads us. And if our interconnectedness with nature isn't understood, if it's not felt viscerally, if we don't train in that, if it's obscured in any way, then we enter into what has been called the fundamental darkness. That feeling of loneliness, separation, disconnectedness. There's so much joy and beauty in this life. And we think about what's the most fulfilling part of having this gift of life. And I think it might hinge around that the deepest sense of fulfillment is that feeling of interconnectedness when we feel it. You know? It's an experience that we can have of connectedness. When we feel that, there is a kind of uplifting fulfillment. And when we don't feel it, there can be fear and isolation. And so any time that a thought is inclined, or our speech, or our actions are inclined to support that connectedness, there's generally an uplifting feeling. But however, under the influence of ignorance, it should be a new ticket that you get by the police. You know, UII, you know, we tend to look for our salvation through acquisition, getting more things. Now there's of course a survival energy driving that along too. More resources so that we have more acorns when things are bad, and all of that, and the fear of being without anything. So there's a lot of that involved, and it can be excessive, and it can lead to that more kind of more of those feelings of separation, isolation, when that becomes our God, so to speak. And so that's where greed gets the fuel, that kind of momentum. And oftentimes it's unseen, we don't see it, and it becomes uncontrolled. And sometimes it's at the cost of suffering and happiness of others and the environment, for sure. So we've got these series of delusions, and they're driven by our survival energies. And if we can't find a way to temper that, well, then all manner of harm falls out of that, to ourselves, to our families, communities, the environment, etc. So anger, that's another of the quote unquote poisons. But that really has to do with all the aversive energies, which can be rage, revenge, envy, fear, guilt, shame. They're all driven by survival also, if we look at it. And they're misguidedly trying to protect us in some way or another. So it's no wonder that the events of 9/11 kind of spiraled out into one disaster after another, generated by consciousness or consciousnesses that played into those energies. Maybe sometimes I look at the human race and I think, well, we're just adolescents. We're not quite there yet. We're almost there, So these energies were driving the consciousness of those responsible for those horrific acts. And those same energies were responsible for those reacting to those horrific acts. We see the result. So we're learning to work more skillfully with those energies on an individual basis. That's the crux of practice. But just as we have those same energies that drove the events of 9/11 and the aftermath in us, we have these beautiful counterbalancing energies also. It's part of the deal of being born and being a human. We have a basket of natural energies. Now, we could call them the better angels of our nature. They're every bit as present as those other ones. In Buddhism, they call them the 7 factors of awakening, or the enlightenment factors. And the 7 of them, they're broken into 2 groups of 3. One group are kind of energizing factors. They're enlivening. They're activated. They're up and alert. They're going. And the other, and those 3 are investigation, energy, and joy. They've got life and action in them. And then the other 3 are kind of seen as the calming or tranquilizing factors. And they are tranquility, samadhi, and equanimity. Samadhi being the ability to concentrate and pull the mind and heart together. And so the 7th is mindfulness. And we need to be awake to these energies, know when they arise, so we can, in a sense, enhance them, pay attention to them, watch them, these better angels. And so mindfulness is involved in all of them. I mean, it's like marbled through these 7 factors of awakening. It's like the balancing factor. You have the activating ones and you have the tranquilizing or the calming ones. But it's marbling through there. Remember when I worked in a restaurant as a short order cook and a dishwasher, and the old irascible chef, he teaching me about, well, what's a good meat? You know, you look for all the fat that, I've been a vegetarian for 45 years, but back then, you know, you look for all the fat marbled through there. It gives the good taste. If it's too lean, it's going to lose its taste. It's the fat, you know. So it's like the mindfulness gives these factors the good taste and the juice, kind of, you know, keeps them all alive and growing. So, so we bring attention to these better angels of our nature, our birthright in a sense. And as they gain in power, there's going to be less room for the power of these other human energies too. These poisons, or these, you know, the forms of greed, the forms of aversion, the forms of delusion. So I want to run through these very quickly, and then we'll do a reflection where we're going to try to feel into them. So investigation. It's not really so much an analysis. It's a differentiation process or a discrimination process of what leads to harm and what leads to harmony. You know, so what about these thoughts that I'm having? Are those thoughts leading to harm or harmony? That's the investigation. You know, what about what I'm about to say? Is that going to lead to harm or harmony? And my actions, the same thing. Harm or harmony. So it's this constant refinement, investigation. You know, it's a discrimination. And so that takes energy, the second factor. We have to contact the energy, to have enough energy to begin to make those discriminations, to think before we speak, to alter our thought patterns if they're harmful to us or others. You know, that takes some energy. So as we begin investigation, the energy can come with us. We have interest. Well, this is an interesting concept. Harm or harmony, you know? Oh, let me think about that, you know? And then energy comes to that. And as we begin to have the energy, as we begin to make those discriminations and differentiations that are kind of inclining in a wholesome direction, well, then joy arises. And joy has that kind of active feeling to it, a pleasantness, but there's energy in it. So we have this investigation, this energy, this joy happening. And out of that inclination towards the wholesome and towards joy, there's an element of calm that begins to come through. You know, the joy begins to soothe and calm the whole system. And so we start to feel some tranquility. Now we're on the other side of these 7 factors. Okay? And as we get calmer, we're better able to, the energies of the heart and mind can gather and unify and come into a concentrated state, into what's known as samadhi, which is this basket of beautiful characteristics. And it's out of that samadhi that we can see more clearly into the nature of nature, into issues in our lives, into issues in our community and culture, etc. See, penetrate more deeply with a heart and mind that is stable and powerful. And out of that comes greater understanding, which leads to equanimity, a kind of the ability to be in balance with the pleasant and the unpleasant, that we can be with the events of life, not in a heartless way. You know, equanimity has heart. If heart is not there, then we're resisting in some way. You know, that's not equanimity. Indifference is not there. Being chilled out and being indifferent is not equanimity. Equanimity has an open heart, but it's a balanced receptivity and a capacity to be with what is. So this is how we train. Yes, we understand. We look at these challenging energies, these survival energies, and we find ways to work with them more skillfully. And at the same time, we want to come and recognize and come in close relationship with these awakening factors, and we can. And when we're paying attention to them, we're sensitizing ourselves to them, inclining ourselves, and kind of lifting ourselves up. So I want to do like a 5-minute little meditation where we kind of roll through these and see if we can feel them in us. It's an experiment. But I often roll through these when I'm meditating myself, just to see. And each of us, some are strong, some not so strong. So let's come inside, maybe take a couple of deeper breaths. An investigation. What thoughts lead to harm to me or others? And what thoughts lead to harmony? I have the capacity to alter course if I notice thoughts are heading to harm. I can do it. It takes mindfulness to notice. And the same for speech. Can I pause just for a few nanoseconds? What I'm about to say, will it harm? Or will it create greater harmony? And the same with actions. And to carry on this continued refinement of investigation of our thoughts, speech, and actions, take a moment and feel the energy in this living organism known as you and me. There is energy. And there is the capacity of knowing, that mindfulness of what is happening. We can feel the energy. And sometimes by just noticing, asking the question, where's the energy? We turn our attention to it, we're mindful of it. It can rise to meet the situation. to meet that investigation, that discrimination. Inclining through discrimination, through investigation, thought, speech, and action towards harmony. Feeling the energy to do that, we can begin to also taste or smell the joy of that inclination. The joy of the better angels of our nature. And as we begin to refine and move, there can be a tranquility, a calming, there's a calming aspect when there is not remorse. When the inclination is to the wholesome. And out of that calming, we can begin to gather these forces of heart and mind. Maybe resting attention on our breath. Drawing those energies together. Gently but consistently cultivating that power of heart and mind through samadhi, through concentration. It takes mindfulness. Being awake to the breath or our object. And out of that practice and exercising, we can enter into our relationships in this world, both with others and our biosphere, with more balance. With a view, with a perspective that is wise, that understands the impermanence of this creation, that understands the suffering and the causes of suffering. We can receive our experience with more understanding and balance. With a heart that's open. Not indifferent. Open and balanced. These factors of awakening, the capacity to investigate, to differentiate between harm and harmony. The energy calling forth, meeting that challenge of discrimination, and the joy that comes with that, followed by the calming. Followed by the greater capacity to bring the powers of heart and mind together to see more clearly what the nature of nature is. And to allow us to receive our experience with balance. These are the factors of awakening. They counterbalance. And they can be stronger than survival instincts, the three poisons. And it takes practice. It takes attention. So that was just a little voyage into those factors. We don't have to create them. They're already here. And some you might have noticed, well, I'm really strong at that. And others, I could use a little, you know. So, the UNESCO Constitution says this: since wars begin in the minds of men and women, it is in the minds of men and women that the defenses of peace must be constructed. Sounds like our practice, enhancing those better angels of our nature. We can do it individually, we can do it in our communities. That's where it all starts. So I'll end with, maybe it's my favorite Whitman quote. Pausing, searching, receiving, contemplating. Gently, but with undeniable will, divesting myself of the holds that would hold me. I inhale great draughts of space. The east and the west are mine, and the north and the south are mine. I am larger, better than I thought. I did not know I held so much goodness. So thank you.